Thank you very much indeed, Sam. Hi, all of you. Good evening from uncharacteristically sunny London, where everyone is moaning that the temperature is now over 70 degrees and no one can cope. Just to start us off, David and Mabel, I mean, in a sense, France has had a little bit of a break from politics with the Olympics, but I just wondered where you think France is at now. We still don't have a permanent prime minister. We've still got the political situation that the election left us with. Where, how would you characterize the political situation in France now? Whoever wants to go first.
I don't mind going first.
Yep.
First of all, before I go, I want to thank Sam Peterson and the Pacific Council for inviting me. This is my second time here, so I'm looking forward to the discussion. Where would I put France today? Probably confused is a quick adjective for it all. But I'm going to be really, I'm going to be really quick and give a sort of very quick sort of summary, as it were, of what happened here, basically. And I want to say I'm with two political scientists, and I usually take a historical approach to things. So I've been following the Rassemblement National and indeed right-wing politics now since 1998. And I always look at them sort of in the context of the longue durée, as it were. And I just want to say a few things about what's going on in France and the European elections. It was widely predicted and expected, sometimes predictions and expectations don't go together in politics, but that the RN would come in first. And if you read the press, it sort of looks like, oh my God, where did they come from? They just came out of nowhere and this earthquake happened. And that happens all the time. Whenever the RN comes in, it's the way it's described in the international press. But the RN has been around for quite a while, and it's actually been doing very well for quite a while. Since the 2014 European election, it's been coming in the #1 party in France. But at any rate, when it came in #1 this time, President Macron decided to call a snap election. He dissolved the French Assembly, which he is allowed to do as president. He pointed to the example of Chirac and de Gaulle, which, much as I like history, this isn't exactly the place I would go for this. And from the moment he did it, it was widely perceived as a disaster. And then he would basically give the National Assembly election to the RN. And they already had 89 seats, which was remarkable from 2022. So at any rate, his argument, to the extent he had an argument, was that the RN might come out ahead and then they do such a bad job of governing that they would never win the election. The presidential election in 2027. Nonetheless, that's not exactly what happened. And just quickly, on the first round, the RN did come on top with the most seats. But the French voting system has a second round. And in the past, the RN has been kept out of government by everybody getting together, other parties getting together to push them, to vote against them, basically. And indeed, that, to everyone's surprise, that actually did work this time. So that's where Macron, who he thought his party would do quite well, is now sort of in third place and is jockeying around somehow to form a government, which he still hasn't formed. I mean, they still don't have a prime minister. So I want to leave it at there. I said it was confused. I will just give 3 takeaways and then that's it. 1, the RN is growing and has been growing since 2014. I don't expect them to go away, and they're not new. They did in the first round of the National Assembly, they got the most seats. They almost came to having the majority, and then they'd have a prime minister. However, in the second round, they dropped. They dropped 143 seats, but they still gained 54. So without the numbers, they're not losing, they're increasing. And the second, and I guess the third point is that in many ways, what this election showed on both the spectacular sort of resurgence of a left coalition and then the right coalition, that there's kind of been what I call a recalibration of political commitments in France. And one of the most interesting takeaways for me has been that the RN actually got a large portion of the youth vote in France. And then when they did the second round, the left got that vote too. But as it applies to the RN, I mean, this is no longer Marine Le Pen's father's party. And the other thing is that in many ways, the living memory of, first of all, Vichy France, which everybody likes to talk about in these cases, the living memory of fascism, the living memory of Marxism in '68 is gradually dying off. Young people who are voting out, they don't remember even Jean-Marie Le Pen in 2002. And basically, you get a new generation, both on the left and the right, who are willing to vote for parties that their parents would never consider voting for. So I'll leave it there. That doesn't mean anything solved, but that's where it is.
Thank you very much, Mabel. David.
Oh, thank you, Anand, and thank you, Mabel, for that nice survey, that quick overview of developments in France. I certainly agree with that quick summary. It seems to me that the big takeaway here is that, yes, the RN didn't do as well in the second round as was predicted. They did very well. The left did very well, and of the left-wing coalition, it was the far left party, La France Insoumise, which did best. And the center, which has managed to hold together control of the political situation through tactical maneuvers, was hammered. The center has been considerably hollowed out. And that's a continuation of a trend that we've seen in France really since the formation of Emmanuel Macron's En Marche party, now Renaissance. But he's borrowed from the socialists, he's borrowed from the Republicans, he's weakened as a consequence the center left and the center right, and what's left are the two extremes. The center is governing right now, or is poised to govern, but that doesn't reflect the outcome of the election, and it is likely to go down very poorly with the French electorate.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting point there, David, which is to what extent we're living with the consequences of Macron blowing up the French political system, because he's created a political movement that really isn't a proper political party with deep roots in the French population. And just in that last election, I got a real sense that that was coming back to bite him a little bit. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's absolutely correct. I think, again, it was a personal movement. The fact that En Marche shares Emmanuel Macron's initials, the political movement was initially a personal movement, and that it's been somewhat institutionalized, but not in the true French political sense. It does not have the deep roots that you've referred to. And the two parties that used to be the mainstays of French politics have been so weakened, so dramatically weakened, that it is likely to appear to French onlookers that the only escape is through the far left or through the far right. The only escape from this politics of centrism, where there's not a sort of a technocratic approach to government, which is not popular at all. I think of this, I'm a member of the Pacific Council. I'm here on the West Coast, looking from far away, but 2 days ago we had a minor earthquake in Pasadena. I think it's now rated as 4.6 on a Richter scale. We like it when small earthquakes happen. They release tension on the San Andreas Fault, and we hope that there won't be a huge earthquake to follow with massive destruction of property and life. The election did not, if it results in Macron's party having lost the biggest loser in the election, if they end up being the biggest winner in the government, there will be very great dissatisfaction amongst the French. And it's likely to manifest itself in not only in future elections, but on the street as well.
So you're saying that this might be a minor tremor that heralds a major earthquake?
Well, I'm saying that this could have been a minor tremor that would have released tension in the French political system, but I don't see that that's happened. I see that those tensions are still building up.
Would you agree with that, Mary?
When I'm not on the East Coast, I was just in California, and I just got out before the earthquake, and I have a small house. I hadn't thought of the earthquake metaphor in quite that way, but I agree with you. If I had sort of given my whole talk on this, the whole point about the disappearance of the center is absolutely correct. And I don't know, that's why everybody that I know who is like public intellectuals and people who talk about it, besides the social scientists who talk about it, what was Macron thinking? What was he doing? How could this ever end well? But I have to say that the two things I always like to go back to is, and I don't want to give too many numbers on this, but the 2012 presidential election, when it was Hollande and Sarkozy, and Hollande actually won, very close election, and people, as they always are, in the streets in Paris. And the interesting thing about that election was, to me, when you looked at the first round, those first rounds are really interesting in France. It was, I can't remember, I guess it was Hollande, Sarkozy, and then it was Marine Le Pen and Mélenchon. And I thought, and that was 2012. And I must say, I actually was in Paris in 2012, and I went to Mélenchon's first rally, and I thought to myself, this man is really dull. How will he go for? I mean, he lacked charisma, But anyway, it's interesting because Marine Le Pen came in third and Mélenchon came in fourth. And now here we are, 2012, how many years? 12 years later, who's left? The standard parties are gone, the parties that Hollande and Sarkozy. And the people who were the extremes and the outliners are the people who were sort of the majority. Well, they got most of the votes on either end. So I think that's something. It's been coming, is my thought. And then in 2017, I mean, as David put really nicely here, Macron came out of nowhere. And I don't know how many of you remember, there was somebody else who was supposed to be the president, who was supposed to be shoo-in, and he got caught in some kind of a corruption scandal. I can't remember his name at this point. But
François Fillon.
Yeah, and it's just like there's been all of these it's been like the earthquake. There've been lots of these little trends, and and here we are, and you're right. I mean, if Macron pushes through one of his people as the prime minister, nobody is going to look at that as legitimate. So it's not a good place to be right now.
I mean, it is a remarkable situation. It's worth reminding ourselves that both the centre left and the centre right basically killed themselves through their own blunders. I mean, there was a remarkable point where Hollande stood second time, where he was polling at 6. I mean, I was 6 percentage points behind him in the polls. He was polling 6%, which for a sitting president is just unbelievable. So, I mean, it's a story of the centre sort of killing itself and Macron trying to take advantage. I mean, we were talking before we came on, and I'm very keen to ask this question because I'm obsessed by this question, because we've just had the Olympics, and French politics has essentially hit the pause button while everyone went out on the streets of France and, well, initially got very wet and then had a very good Olympic Games. And it was all very Roman Empire to me. It was all very bread and circus. It was kind of, if the populace are dissatisfied, let's throw some games. And I just wondered whether you thought the Olympics are going to have a lasting impact. I mean, are we suddenly going to wake up and be back where we started, or has the sort of feel-good factor that seemed to consume France during the Olympics made any political difference at all, do you think?
David?
Well, The way I look at this, Macron went before the Olympics began, said, "Look, we're going to take a pause. We're going to step back from politics. It's going to be in the tradition of the Olympic Games. We're going to cease our warfare, and we're going to come together and enjoy the competition." I think that's the sort of Olympian gesture, the sort of Jupiterian approach to politics that has so alienated the French people, that he stands above politics, that he's not part of it, that he can tell people to stop, and that they do for a time, and everyone wanted the Olympics to be successful, and it was a great success. But none of the problems that were so present and were so talked about 3 and 4 weeks and 3, 4, and 5 weeks ago have gone away. So I don't think there will be a lasting impact, other than that it's given people a chance to reflect upon the math in the parliament, which isn't an easy math to resolve. Putting together a governing coalition is going to be a serious challenge.
You know, I was in France right before I was in France for the second round, but I was there right after the first round, and I had sort of thought I'd go in the streets, you know, on the night of the second round, assuming the right won. And the right didn't win, and I didn't go in the streets because I got COVID. But everybody was complaining to me for that week that I was in France, and many of like the hotel keepers, and you know, and it didn't turn out, at least for the hotel keepers, exactly the way they thought it was going to be. So I mean, the people I thought of talked to, you know, just like, I'm glad I'm getting out of town, and you know, I didn't make as much money as I thought I would. Now I assume they did in the end. So I assume that won't have a lasting effect. It did remind me, though, when you were talking, when David, and when you asked the question, in 1998, when the people thought it was an earthquake because Jean-Marie Le Pen did very well in the regional elections. The same summer, the French won the World Cup. I was blanking on and both Chirac and Jospin had this big event to welcome the team in you know, a walk down the Champs-Elysees. And you know, it was funny what happened. I got suddenly interested in soccer and World Cup metaphors, but the French used that for a long time to discuss, you know, politics, and they got totally upset when they lost the next World Cup, and then Zidane, the headbutter. If any of you remember, I really got into French soccer for a while, but it has a, you know, it's a metaphor. But I don't see the metaphor here actually, because they did a good job. You know, it was very spectacular, but I don't know. Hard times to think this is going to last. They're waking up, and they've got to have a prime minister, and so does Macron. So.
Yeah, and there are real socioeconomic issues that haven't changed.
Yeah, we didn't even get to those.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Can I just mirror to all of you watching the message that's just come round on the chat, that do put your questions in the Q&A box, anything about France or broader European questions that you want to pose to these two excellent speakers, stick them in the chat, in the Q&A, and I'll pose them. One thing that struck me, I think, David, you said people vote against. I mean, that's what's happened in this French election. The second round, people use it as an opportunity to vote against. And across the Western world, I mean, we saw that very, very strongly in the election in the United Kingdom, that, you know, a Labour Party leader who wasn't very popular won a massive majority because the Conservatives were very unpopular. You see it in this, I think they're called the haters in the United States, the people who don't like either side, and it's a question of who you dislike least. Is that a problem for democracy if voters are voting against rather than voting for? Does that mean that there's something inherently wrong with our political systems, that people are so little enthused by what's on offer?
Well, I mean, One ideal, one, what we've all learned in school, so to speak, one would like to have our citizens voting for people that they actually thought represented whatever their views were, et cetera, or that they had enough interest in politics, or that and that doesn't. It doesn't seem to be exactly what's going on in the Western democracies. I mean, I've sort of been swept away, I have to say, by the United States in the last 2 weeks, where we've had this just almost miraculous turnaround in the Democratic election. I mean, I can't help but anybody or in the, with the Democratic Party. And when Kamala Harris, and I really, I just changed my voting registration to New York. I was always voting in California, and I voted for her many times. And I thought she was an intelligent person. And when they first made the switch, I was just thinking, oh, it's nice to see somebody that looks alive, not sick. And then, but suddenly something else is taken off, and it actually speaks to your question, I think, in the sense of what is driving this sudden turn when the newspapers are complaining, oh, there's no policy out there, suddenly the numbers are changing dramatically. So I guess the question I ask, and I would ask of both of you, is to what extent is the theories we learn about democracy not working with what we're observing, and maybe there's something else that's pushing people to make these decisions, whether it be against, or that suddenly you see this charismatic person and you're suddenly changed your interest and you're out voting. I don't have an answer to that, but it's certainly a good question.
David?
Anand, I think voting against the candidate you least prefer is not a new phenomena. I certainly remember it through all my political my adult years, and as I understand it, Roosevelt was not beloved by half the country. So that's a long-standing phenomena. Here in the U.S., what used to be said about the Republicans and the Democrats is there's not a dime's worth of difference between them. So why vote? What's the purpose of voting? Nobody maintains that anymore. They may still say that there's no point in voting, but not because there's no difference between the two parties. And the fact that there's no difference between the two parties, I think, goes back to the same phenomena that we were discussing in the French context, which is to say that your liberal Republicans, your conservative Democrats are, if not dying, if not extinct, at least dying. They are rare species at this point. There's been a pretty substantial separation of the two parties. I note that with their vice presidential picks, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris both chose to appeal to the base rather than move to the center. They doubled down on the party's appeal to its core voters. And that's a change, I think, in the way American politics was set up previously. And I think it's likewise a change in the French political context, people voting for the extremes in large numbers.
And in particular, as one of you said before, the really interesting thing in France is the number of young people, young voters, who are voting for the extremes. And that for a Brit is quite alien, because actually young voters here don't vote, certainly for the far-right Reform Party, in any great numbers. We don't have a far-left party really of any note in this country at the moment. But in France, you have large numbers of young voters voting either for the far-right or for the far-left. And in a way, it's hard not to find that really depressing for the future of French democracy. The demographic trends almost seem to be pointing in the wrong way. Do you think I'm being overly depressed about this, or is this something we should worry about? I'm a bit of a worrier.
Young people grow up. They grow up.
Yeah, no, true. So
what was striking in the 2022 presidential election, when I was giving a talk somewhere and looking at the numbers, You could start to see the shift to the youth for Le Pen and even for the left, and you also see women. That's been another big shift.
Yeah.
But the thing of it was almost amusing with Macron's numbers in 2022 was they were all people over 50, 60, 70. That was his biggest constituency, those who, the people probably remembered this. Well, they should have remembered 68, but they were sort of all now the center or the neoliberal or whatever you want to call that, and it was striking, actually, very interesting. So.
In the British context, you referred to reform. I think that's the latest incarnation or rebranding of Nigel Farage. Am I getting that correct? Yeah. So, who is, and oftentimes, protest parties are protesting against the old fogies who are representing the status quo. But Farage is perhaps the old fogiest of all.
Absolutely.
In France, I think it was, perhaps it wasn't as brilliant as I was about to claim, but it was noteworthy that Marine Le Pen chose as her standard bearer, not herself, but a relatively young man, Jordan Bardella, to be the face of the movement and of the party and the potential new prime minister. And I think to good effect, at least in the first round. And again, even in the second round, the right did very well on historical by historical standards. They didn't meet expectations, which were sky high, but they did better than in any previous election.
Yeah, no, that's true. And Bardella is very, very good on social media, particularly platforms like TikTok. He was very, very effective. And of course, that's a young person's game. But I mean, looking ahead, how do you see things panning out over the next few months? I mean, where will the prime minister come from? Will a prime minister last? Is France governable with the current National Assembly, or are we sort of doomed to face more elections in 10, 11 months now? I suppose he can do it again if he decides to. I mean, where do you see things going in the short to medium term?
Well, as I said, I think the math is daunting, and there was this phenomena, the so-called Republican front. So it's everybody against the far right. So we will in the French electoral system, the parliamentary elections, the top three vote getters advance to the second round, and whoever was in third place, whether it was a centrist candidate or a party of the left-wing coalition, would voluntarily drop out and throw their support behind someone who they didn't agree with, in order to keep the far right out of power. And that worked. Again, as Mabel suggested, it was surprising how well it worked, that candidates did actually follow that guidance, and that the population voted in many cases for candidates who did not represent their underlying ideological preferences. So they voted, they were prepared to vote tactically. I'm a centrist myself. So part of me is rooting for a centrist government and a centrist coalition to come out of this mess. But Mabel mentioned the longue durée, and I'm worried about what the consequences will be if, again, you have an election and there is no effect on government, despite the fact that the governing coalition did extremely poorly. That concerns me about what will happen in the 2027 presidential election and in future elections. And here I get a bit lost because, again, the left-wing coalition didn't seem to have anything they didn't seem to have a common policy platform, except on a few very broad points. Certainly didn't have an agreement about where their leadership would come from.
Yeah.
So it's not clear to me that anyone but the center is poised to fill the void, and I'm not sure that's a good thing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I agree very much with what David is saying. I mean, on some level, I was thinking when you just said about the left, oh, well, the right has a very good, they're more cohesive, but they're not so cohesive either because they have an extreme component to them that may or may not, get on board with Marine Le Pen, etc. So it's not clear. I mean, I sort of think, there's the great political scientist Daniel Ziblatt, who wrote the book about the center is what holds all the time, and that's where you get the successful parties that actually keep it was written on the 20s and 30s in Europe. That's what keeps fascism and everything else at bay. But the center is Macron, and nobody likes Macron. Everybody hates Macron, and this is where his judgment. I mean, I just I started out with saying, what was he thinking? And it seemed to me that everybody's they really didn't seem to be any good outcome to this. Did he really think everybody was going to vote for him when everybody hates him? His party. So it just seemed it was a bad idea that it isn't. I don't see a good solution, and I was just reading the three likely candidates according to Politico this morning for the Prime Minister of France, and I was thinking, and then nobody seemed to know who they were anyway. Or I mean, one of them I sort of recognized who it was, but I don't have a good answer. I mean, something will get. I'm guessing, it's only a guess, that something will get pushed through. And even though France isn't used to cohabitation and all the rest of it, somehow they'll manage something and nobody will be happy. And they might get to probably Macron won't be dumb enough to call another dissolution of parliament. And they'll stumble onto the 2027 election, but I don't have any great insights into why it's just my insight from, watching them, but who knows, whoever thought he was going to call an election. I don't know. Predictions from anyone else on this?
Yeah. I mean,
you have to have some predictions now.
I mean, I just worry that the current situation plays into the hands of the extremes because you get an ineffective centrist government, you get this earthquake in the elections that isn't reflected at all in the governing outcome. A load of people thinking, but hang on a sec, this is absolutely what I voted against, and it's still there in power. And actually, there's part of me that thinks that if I was Marine Le Pen, this would almost be the best of all worlds for me. I mean, yeah, it would have been nice to get more votes in the second round, but actually you can just sit and watch the center fail right up to the next presidential election. And of course, the nightmare scenario for France, I mean, you've got this insulation, haven't you, that if you have a centrist and an extremist in the second round, we can all assume that the centrists will win because everyone will rally behind them. But if you have a second round that's Mélenchon Le Pen,
nightmare.
Yeah, then all bets are off. And actually, the first time Macron got elected, we were only a couple of percentage points away from that. And so my fear is that this is almost the worst of all worlds. And in substantive terms, actually, we've got a question in from Richard Welsh, which is a really good question, which is, how do you think any new government, if we get one, is going to change French budgetary priorities and deficits, sovereign debt yields, and other economic considerations? Because the French economy is not in a good place at the moment. And can you see any sort of feasible government that comes into power between now and when we have the next presidential election actually being able to take the sort of decisive action on the economic front that France so desperately needs?
Ugh.
It's an easy one for you.
Well, cohabitation. So the fact of having the president and the prime minister from different political persuasions, different different political families. That wasn't a standard feature of the Fifth Republic, but we've seen it. We know what it looks like, and it's been successful. This is different than simply cohabitation. This is the absence of a governing coalition of any political complexion that emerges naturally from the arithmetic of the election. It's unclear how you get a budget passed with this constellation of political parties. And Macron's preference would be to put together a centrist coalition, excluding La France Insoumise to the far left and excluding Marine Le Pen and the National Rally to the far right. But La France Insoumise is the biggest vote winner on the left wing. The National Rally was the biggest vote winner of any single party. You take those two out of the math, there's not enough left for a governing coalition.
Yeah.
So to the question about what is this likely to mean, if as I partly fear, a centrist government is formed and pursues the policies that Macron desires, then you'll see probably some modest modification of the budgetary priorities that he's advanced successfully from the Matignon. But both the far left and far right are calling to explode the deficit, to increase spending, to reduce taxes. And there's probably going to, in order to get at least some of them to defect and support a budget, there's probably going to be some modification of those plans that the president has so carefully nurtured, but not enough to satisfy the electorate, but probably enough, Anon, to your point, to result in an economy that does not self-correct and is a little bit worse off heading into the next political period.
I mean, all of the, oh, I'm sorry.
No, sorry, go on.
All of the political discourse on the right, when, Marine Le Pen shifted to economic issues a long time ago. And there was also a point where she sounded like, what leftists used to talk about, right? Anti-globalization, the power of the people. But right now, what people talk about in France all the time is these pocketbook issues. Can they afford food? Do they have a job? Can they afford gasoline? When the yellow vests were first came on the scene in 2018, they said, why should I, for some green program, why should I, have to pay more taxes on cars, which I actually drive, because I have to go drive to work, and the French, who live in the center of the city can get on the metro or something like that, or their bicycles, and they have more money than I do anyway, the people that are pushing it through. And there are these kind of real economic and class issues and regional issues that aside from the sort of grand, inflation, well, inflation is going to be an issue, but those kind of bread and butter, pocketbook, whatever you want to call it, they really affect the way people live in a way that hardly ever gets talked about much, except, I mean, you hear it more from you certainly hear it more from the right, or at least Le Pen's version of the right. You're supposed to hear that from the left, and you sort of do, but you don't hear it so much. I mean, he gives lip service to it, Macron, but basically he has very grand economic plans that don't really work with, the sort of needs on the street, let's put it that way,
Mm.
I mean, look at the pension age, the retirement age, and, Marine Le Pen, she's dropping it down to 62 if she gets elected. What did he raise it to? I mean, there are all those kind of issues that are going to play into this in a big way. So,
yeah. I mean, I'm torn on this because, every 10 years, The Economist does a front page in which it says France is doomed and France is about to explode and the economy is about to collapse. And it never happens. And so we go through another 10-year cycle. This particular cycle feels a bit different. And I think, Richard, in answer to your question, you were talking about gilt yields. There is going to be an issue because the markets are only going to respond one way, and French debt is going to become harder to service. It's going to become more expensive because the markets, quite rightly, I think, don't have faith in the ability of French politicians to take the decisions that need taking. And of course, at the same time, you have looming on the horizon the prospect of Brussels starting to come down heavy on debt levels. And so, economically, the situation feels to me very, very tight. And that actually, you almost end up in a vicious circle where the politics is dysfunctional, the economics goes slightly worse, and the politics gets worse because the economics gets worse. There's less money to sort of, buy off the protesters, as it were, or to sort of give generously to some of the poorer regions. And I mean, actually, that brings me to another question, which is, this all undermines France's ability to play a leadership role in Europe to any great extent, doesn't it? This domestic sort of unrest.
I think that's absolutely true. I think the Macron is a diminished figure. He was a diminished figure even before as soon as he announced the election, he was a diminished figure because the opinion polls were quite clear. So at international gatherings, he was no longer the sort of magnetic center of attention. And I think for the EU, that's a serious problem. The continental couple, the dynamic axis that drives European politics between Berlin and Paris, neither of those actors seems particularly cogent, particularly vital at the present time. In Germany, you've got a coalition that was elected on a domestic, a center-left domestic agenda, and then they were suddenly faced with the prospect of war on the eastern frontier as Putin's Russia invaded Ukraine. Their plans were upended. They've managed to patch things together and to move forward at a pace at a time. But there are no grand visions for Europe that I've seen emerging from Germany.
No.
Keir Starmer would be a terrific interlocutor. He seems to me like a thoughtful man, but he's not part of the equation anymore. And Emmanuel Macron thinks deep thoughts, but nobody's going to take him as seriously as they did previously. So where does the energy come from? It's not clear to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's the takeaway. They'd be far better off with the Brits. But Mabel.
No, I was just agreeing with what I was shaking my head. Yes, that's why. I mean, I guess that's why I find this also puzzling that he would even call this election, because it seems to me so obvious that this would end badly, And it has in many ways. It's the way that David just outlined in Europe, in the EU, and. Yeah, I mean, I don't see a really good end to this. I mean, and I would, if I were Marine Le Pen, sit there happily and just let it play out.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I should say in Europe at the moment is there are no signs of the erosion of losers' consent in the way that we see with the Trump campaign in the United States. That is to say, when people lose elections, they lose elections. And, actually, one of the reassuring things in the UK, where politics, God knows, got very poisonous for a while, was that the Conservatives conceded very, very graciously indeed, in a break with the style they've adopted for the last 10 years, maybe. But so, there's a straw to cling on to.
When Trump got elected, I wrote some kind of I wrote in like a, sort of public essay. And I said that the title of it was Trump is not a European style populist, and that's our problem. And this was 2016, before we knew anything about anything that was going to happen. But what I argued in it was that all of these people, and at that time my reference point there was Marine Le Pen, but none of the people really who were running as populists or whatever you want to call them, none of them exactly are calling for the taking down of the state, not accepting the results of the election. And the argument in that was, we don't know what Trump's going to do, so he's dangerous. Whereas there is a kind of predictability to some of these right-wingers in Europe, is that they basically want to sort of, I won't even use the words infiltrate the state. I mean, they want to bring the states back to, say, the 1950s European state or the 1960s European state. That is not what we've got in the United States. So, I mean, I won't speak to Eastern Europe because I feel like that's a different ballpark in many ways. But it's the kinds of people that we're speaking of, Maloney, people say, oh, she's bringing back the fascist regime. And she's not bringing back the fascist regime. Today I just read a statistic that actually employment in Italy is up. Like, the figures are really good. Who knows why? That's always a issue in Italy. But and how can you say it's because she had such great policies, or what happened? But that's not the case in France. I didn't check the employment figures in France before I came here, but things.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we're very fond in Europe of saying, "Oh my God, we're becoming like the United States," and we don't generally mean that in a positive way. We generally mean that we're becoming polarized, we're becoming divided.
Yeah.
I think I take all those comparisons with a massive pinch of salt, because whenever I go to the US, I'm struck by just how much more polarized your country seems than any European country at the moment. But the one area, I suppose, where things are shifting in Europe is that values politics, sort of social values, whether it's race, which is impinging more and more on politics, or, debates about social values are becoming more common. I mean, Brexit was a debate about social values. It wasn't a debate about economics. And does that apply in France as well, do you think? Do you think that there is a sort of values divide opening up between sort of social liberal, city dwelling, metropolitan elites, if you like, and the sort of France profonde, where people have far more traditional values? Is that part of what's happening in French politics at the moment?
Well, I think that global versus patriots or nationalists and argument that is frequently made on the right, it does have a certain validity to it, in the sense there is certainly a rural-urban divide. You can see it in French politics. You can see it in many places. You could even see it in the United States a bit. More than a bit. I mean, when I'm not sitting in New York or California, I'm teaching in Ithaca, and we do have, you really sort of understand the rural core of the United States. And a lot of those people who used to live in the city feel displaced, in the sense that they can't afford to live there because all these academics and tech people are coming in, and they have to live outside. So I think that that's a real issue. I don't think it's anything to be disregarded. I do think that that's a country by country analysis in a way, because I always laugh that even the elite French are pretty nationalist in their way, and you know that, I'm sure. But I think it's important. I'm not sure if it really drives the elections, though. I mean, I know there's been a big debate about that in populist, people write about populism and things like that. I mean, I think some of these more on the ground issues are how will I be able to, buy my carrots and gasoline, are more important. Why do I have to eat this EU cheese when I have French, the supermarkets, and stuff. The farmers, let's not forget the farmers' strikes that were all over Europe last.
But would you not agree that those things are linked? That is to say, if you're struggling to buy bread or buy petrol or whatever it might be, you are more likely to blame immigrants, blame elites, And so, you know, there's a causal relationship between the two, isn't there? But when it turns into that sort of values conflict, it becomes harder to mediate in a way, because these
Yeah,
things.
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you. I don't know what, sometimes the
Oh, David,
sound.
can you hear me, David? Or is it?
Yeah,
I certainly can.
sometimes you go in and out. I don't know if you can hear me, but
Okay, I have a very loud voice, so it must be something to do with it.
well, you sound very softly speaking right now. So
That is not me.
maybe it's my computer, but so
I mean, David, what do you think about this, the values
yeah.
divide? I mean, certainly there is a city-rural divide, but is there something more profound going on in French politics?
I would simply note that the appeal of the far right is certainly an anti-immigrant appeal, to a certain degree, an anti-Islamic feel to it, but it's not necessarily an appeal to conservative values. It's not pro-Catholic. It's not. It's secular in that sense. It's not trying to return the church to a more central place in people's lives. I think Le Pen and her successful counterparts elsewhere in Europe have been very careful, at least in Western Europe, have been careful to. I'm thinking about Silvio Berlusconi. I mean, he was not a champion of family values, but he was able to tap national resentment.
I hate to tell you, last summer I gave up an hour of my life to listen to his funeral service in the Central Cathedral of the Catholic Church in Milan. And I was interested in exactly listening to this thing, because he, in all, doctrine of the Catholic Church, right, he would be a big sinner. But it was very interesting to hear, first of all, there's this secular approach to an odd secular approach to religion, that he's Catholic. He would, of course, have a Catholic ceremony. And the priest, the bishop who was he said at one point that maybe Berlusconi had too many. How do you put it? He was too spirited, and that might put him into purgatory or something till he, but other than that, and he wasn't always as virtuous as we would have wanted, but eventually he's going to get to heaven, that's not a very doctrinal approach to Catholicism, but it is as a ritual. But I don't think, that's kind of, I think, a peculiarity of Italy. And in fact, what David is saying, the French have always wanted to keep the church out of things, and they certainly, that's their argument with Islam, actually. But the thing about immigration, which is puzzling to me, and in all the years I've been following this, is I do not understand why. I mean, I know it's a difficult problem. It's a difficult problem in the United States, but there's got to be, by now, anybody who's ruling anything in Europe should know it's a difficult problem. There are people that need to move. There are refugees. I've always been sort of amazed that people can't come up with some policy position or a policy that is just and fair and compassionate and sort of figures the whole thing out. Now, I know it's a difficult problem, but people have been working on it for a long time. So, and it always ends up as a political issue.
Yeah, but interestingly, it is interesting that in Europe you have a kind of a curious, weird, liberal anti-immigration. You see that very, very clearly in the Netherlands, where the far right are not traditional right-wing evangelical Catholic types. They are liberal, pro-gay rights. And their argument against immigration is these people coming in are so right-wing in terms of their social values, we shouldn't let them in. So it's a curious inversion of the typical argument somehow.
Yeah. And then we should probably spend at least a moment before we wind things up talking about the broader implications of the French election, not just for the EU, but for the Western Alliance. And I will simply say that, again, if Emmanuel Macron is a diminished figure in Europe, he's likewise a diminished figure in NATO politics. And Germany is in the midst of a transformation of its posture on military affairs and its posture towards Russia. But I think this is an area where Keir Starmer does have an active role to play.
Yeah.
I think that the fear of the Trump presidency is real and well-founded in European capitals. And I think the United Kingdom becomes an important part of whatever solution, not necessarily an extra NATO solution or an alternative to NATO, but to persuade the Americans, whatever complexion of Americans, political complexion of Americans end up occupying the White House and the executive branch, to persuade them that NATO is a vital partner.
No, I agree. I do think we have some difficult decisions to make here about defense spending, because the government has pledged to increase defense spending, but they've said when economic circumstances allow, which strikes me as not a very binding kind of pledge. But I mean, the other thing about the French election and what it means for the Western world, the transatlantic alliance and the United States, I think, is that both of the extremes have, let me put it politely, slightly quirky approaches to foreign policy, to Ukraine. And, you know, it might be worth just spending a moment or two thinking about that, because, you know, the far left aren't interested in sending loads of money and arms to Ukraine. There's a little bit of sort of residual anti-Semitism about lots of the French far left, and the far right too. They take a very sort of a France first approach, don't they? So, I mean, anything but the centre winning the French presidential election has pretty serious consequences for NATO and the Western alliance, doesn't it?
Which did not really happen when Meloni came into Italy, because
No.
she was interested in keeping all those old alliances.
Yeah, though I think people were pleasantly surprised that Meloni sided so unequivocally with her allies on Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting in the run-up to 2027 to see how Le Pen and Bardella position themselves on these issues. In the context at that point, it'll be clear who's occupying the White House, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans. But in either case, there are different permutations that are possible. But there'll be plenty of opportunities for Le Pen to signal where her priorities lie.
Yeah. And of course, the other big conflict going on in the Middle East with Gaza, I mean, that has massive implications for European societies, not least because we have large numbers of Muslim voters. I mean, one of the things we saw, and I mean, no one really noticed it because Labour won by so many votes by so many seats in this country, is Labour hemorrhaged votes in constituencies where there was a high proportion of Muslim voters. Labour actually lost a couple of seats in areas where there were high densities of Muslim voters, and you know, that's a political calculation that sort of makes the formulation of foreign policy around Israel and Gaza all the more difficult. And of course, that can become a really virulent issue in France in the run up to the next election, can't it? If, you know, heaven forbid, this conflict is still going on in some way, shape, or form, that becomes an issue in French politics, doesn't it?
That will, yes.
I think so. And I'd simply throw in on the U.S. side, U.S. support, the Biden administration support for Ukraine, and the support that he's had in the Democratic Party, I think, is thin. It's an inch deep. I think that the Democratic Party has stayed together on this issue because it's the anti-Trump position. But if Trump is removed from the equation, if it's a Harris White House, I don't foresee the Democratic Party coalescing around a robust Ukraine policy. The president very well may, but she may find resistance within her own party in Congress.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And actually, one of the things I notice in Europe at the moment is partly because of the sort of Kamala Harris bounce that we're seeing at the moment is this sense that actually the pressure's slightly off on Ukraine. Because, you know, if we're going to get a democratic president, then actually we don't have to face the nightmare scenario of a President Trump coming into office and saying, we're cutting off aid to Ukraine. So actually, in a sense, that removes some of the pressure on Europeans that was making them confront some hard choices. And I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
I think
it's a miscalculation. I mean, you saw the difficulties the Biden administration had pushing, getting aid to Ukraine. And again, that was the complexion of Congress will change in a variety of different ways, but it's not to be taken for granted that congressional Democrats are going to support a robust defense of Ukraine.
Yeah,
I would agree with that, actually.
okay.
Oh, yes, I would agree with that. Because there's just so many things that have sort of flip-flopped in a way. Not a great political verb, but it seems to be that I don't think you can take old assumptions for granted anymore. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, we have absolutely run out of time.